The morning sun cast long shadows across the private aviation terminal as Dr. Michelle Thompson's black Mercedes pulled up to the entrance. It was 7:15 a.m., and the air had that particular crispness that only early autumn mornings could bring. Michelle, as she was known to her friends, had made this trip to the private airport many times before, but today felt different. At 42 years old, Dr. Thompson had worked incredibly hard to reach her position as one of the country's top neurosurgeons. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her navy blue pantsuit spoke of quiet elegance rather than flashy wealth. A small pearl necklace, a gift from her late grandmother, adorned her neck, a reminder of the woman who had always told her to hold her head high, no matter what. The valet approached her car with a smile, but she politely declined his service. "I won't be long," she said, reaching into the back seat to grab her small overnight bag and medical kit. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she entered the terminal, the sound echoing in the nearly empty space. The private aviation area was always quieter than the main terminal, one of the reasons she preferred it when traveling for emergency surgeries. Today's case was particularly urgent. A 16-year-old girl in Atlanta needed immediate surgery for a rare brain tumor, and Dr. Thompson was one of the few surgeons in the country qualified to perform the delicate procedure. The girl's father, a retired police captain, had specifically requested her after reading about her groundbreaking surgical techniques. As she walked through the terminal, Dr. Thompson mentally reviewed the patient's files stored in her tablet. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the space where a few other early morning travelers sat in plush leather chairs, sipping their coffee. A business executive nodded in recognition. She had operated on his wife last year. The smell of fresh coffee from the terminal's high-end cafe wafted through the air, but Dr. Thompson had already had her morning cup at home. She checked her watch. She was 20 minutes early for her 7:45 a.m. flight, just as she liked it. The private jet, a sleek Gulfstream G650, was visible through the windows, being prepared for takeoff. She could see the ground crew running their final checks. Dr. Thompson approached the security checkpoint with her usual calm confidence. Her credentials were ready in her hand, the same credentials that had granted her access hundreds of times before. Her medical license, airport clearance, and identification were all neatly organized in her leather portfolio. She even carried a special letter from the Atlanta hospital confirming the emergency nature of her flight. Behind the security desk, she noticed a new face, a security guard she hadn't seen before. He was a tall man with graying temples and a stern expression, his name tag reading James Whitaker. Something about his posture changed as she approached, a subtle shift that Dr. Thompson had learned to recognize over her years of breaking barriers in the medical field. Other airport staff members went about their morning routines. The cleaning crew polishing the already spotless floors, the cafe barista arranging fresh pastries, and the desk agents typing away at their computers. It was a normal morning at the private terminal, or at least it seemed to be. Dr. Thompson took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she had done countless times before entering difficult surgeries. The weight of her medical bag reminded her of its contents, the specialized instruments she would need for today's procedure, tools that could save a young girl's life if she could just get to Atlanta on time. As she stepped up to the security checkpoint, Dr. Thompson smiled professionally at Officer Whitaker. She had learned early in her career that a smile could sometimes ease tensions before they began. Her hand extended forward with her credentials, a gesture she had performed thousands of times at hospitals, conferences, and airports across the country. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, creating a glare on the polished floor. A few more travelers had entered the terminal, their quiet conversations creating a gentle backdrop of white noise. The clock on the wall showed 7:28 a.m. In just a few hours, she would be in an operating room in Atlanta, ready to change a young girl's life. Little did Dr. Thompson know that the next few minutes would turn this routine morning into something entirely unexpected, a moment that would not only test her patience, but would also become a powerful lesson about prejudice, professionalism, and the power of words. Officer James Whitaker stared at Dr. Thompson's credentials with narrowed eyes, holding them up to the light as if checking for counterfeits. The security guard's behavior was noticeably different from how he had treated the previous passengers, all of whom had passed through with quick nods and friendly smiles just minutes earlier. "These don't look right to me," Whitaker said loudly, his voice carrying across the quiet terminal. He flipped through her documents again, deliberately slow, his fingers lingering on each page. A private jet? Are you sure you're in the right place, ma'am? His emphasis on ma'am carried a tone that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones. Dr. Thompson maintained her professional composure, though she felt her heart rate quicken slightly. She'd faced similar situations before, but each time still stung. Yes, I'm certain, she replied calmly, reaching into her bag. I have additional identification and my medical license here, along with the emergency authorization from Atlanta General Hospital. Whitaker barely glanced at the additional documents. Instead, he looked past her, as if expecting someone else to appear. And who exactly are you claiming to be? He asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Because I've been working security for 20 years, and I know what private jet passengers look like. A small crowd had begun to gather, trying to appear uninterested while stealing glances at the scene unfolding before them. The cafe barista had stopped arranging pastries, and the cleaning staff had slowed their work to watch. Even the business executive who had nodded to Dr. Thompson earlier was now paying attention, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth. I am Dr. Michelle Thompson, head of neurosurgery at Memorial Hospital, she stated clearly, her voice steady and professional. I'm scheduled to perform emergency surgery in Atlanta this morning. Time is rather crucial in this situation. Whitaker let out a short, dismissive laugh. Right, and I'm the President of the United States. He turned to his colleague at the desk. Hey Bill, come take a look at this. Lady says she's some big shot brain surgeon with a private jet. The pilot of the Gulfstream had noticed the delay and was now walking toward the terminal. Through the windows, the ground crew could be seen looking confused about the holdup. The scheduled departure time was approaching quickly. Officer Whitaker, Dr. Thompson said, maintaining her dignified stance, I understand you're doing your job, but I've used this terminal dozens of times. You can verify my credentials with your supervisor or the hospital. A young girl's life depends on this surgery. Instead of checking her references, Whitaker crossed his arms. Listen here, I don't know how you got these fancy papers, but something doesn't add up. Private jets cost thousands of dollars per hour. Maybe you're confused about which entrance you're supposed to use. The terminal had grown uncomfortably quiet. A young woman near the coffee shop had taken out her phone and was quietly recording the interaction. Another passenger, an elderly gentleman, looked like he wanted to intervene but wasn't sure how. Dr. Thompson took a deep breath, remembering her grandmother's words about dignity under pressure. She reached for her phone. Would you like me to call the hospital administrator, or perhaps the airport manager? I'm happy to have them verify my identity, though I must stress that time is crucial. Oh, now you're threatening to call management. Whitaker's voice grew louder. That's typical. Next thing you'll be telling me this is some sort of discrimination. He placed her credentials down on the desk with unnecessary force. The pilot had finally reached the security checkpoint. Is there a problem here? We're scheduled for takeoff in 15 minutes. He looked concerned, glancing between Dr. Thompson and the security guard. Stay back, sir, Whitaker commanded, waving the pilot away. We have a security situation here. This person is trying to access the private aviation area with what I suspect are fraudulent documents. Dr. Thompson stood perfectly still, her hand resting on her medical bag. 20 years of training in high-pressure situations had taught her to remain calm when others lost their composure. She knew her next words would be crucial, not just for getting to her patient, but for addressing a deeper issue that clearly needed attention. Little did Officer Whitaker know, Dr. Thompson's response would not only challenge his prejudices, but would also force him to confront the potentially devastating consequences of his actions in a way he never expected. The tension in the private terminal had reached a boiling point. What had started as a quiet Monday morning had transformed into an uncomfortable scene that drew more attention with each passing minute. The large windows of the terminal seemed to magnify the morning sun, creating an almost spotlight effect on the unfolding drama. Sarah Chen, the cafe barista, had stopped pretending to organize cups and was now openly watching. In her 3 years working at the private terminal, she had never seen anyone treat a passenger this way. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone, joining the growing number of people recording the incident. This is completely unacceptable, a voice called out from the crowd. It belonged to Marcus Reynolds, the business executive whose wife Dr. Thompson had operated on last year. He stood up from his leather chair, his coffee forgotten on the side table. "I know Dr. Thompson personally. She saved my wife's life." Officer Whitaker turned to face Reynolds, his face reddening. "Sir, please stay out of this. This is a security matter." He shifted his weight, seemingly uncomfortable with the growing attention but unwilling to back down. More passengers had gathered around the scene, creating a loose semicircle about 15 feet from the security desk. Two flight attendants from another private jet had stopped their pre-flight preparations to watch. One whispered to the other, "Isn't she that famous brain surgeon? I've seen her photo in the hospital newsletter." The pilot, Captain David Miller, had pulled out his phone and was speaking quietly but urgently into it. "Yes, sir, we have a situation at security." "No, I've never seen anything like this." "Yes, it's affecting our departure time. The passenger is Dr. Thompson, the neurosurgeon from Memorial." Through the terminal's windows, the ground crew gathered in small groups, pointing and discussing the commotion inside. The gleaming private jet sat waiting on the tarmac, its engine silent when they should have been warming up for takeoff. A young couple with a toddler had stopped near the scene. The woman, dressed in designer clothes, leaned over to her husband and whispered, "That guard is way out of line. Someone should do something." Her husband nodded, bouncing their restless child while keeping his eyes fixed on the confrontation. The number of phones recording the incident had multiplied. At least 7 or 8 devices were now pointed at the security desk, their owners trying to be discreet but clearly documenting everything. One teenager whispered to his mother, "This is going viral for sure." Bill, Officer Whitaker's colleague, shifted uncomfortably behind the security desk. He had worked with Dr. Thompson before and knew exactly who she was, but Whitaker was his superior. His eyes darted between Dr. Thompson and Whitaker, his face showing the internal struggle between doing what was right and following his supervisor's lead. The cleaning staff had completely abandoned their morning duties. Maria, who had been mopping the floors, stood with her mop frozen in her hands. She had seen Dr. Thompson come through this terminal many times, always with a kind word or smile for the staff. The look on her face showed she wanted to speak up but feared for her job. A group of businessmen in expensive suits stood near the coffee shop, their heads bent together in discussion. One of them was already on the phone with what sounded like the airport management. "Yes, this is Richard Davidson from Davidson Corp. You have a serious situation developing in your private terminal." The air in the terminal grew heavier with each passing moment. The usual sounds of a busy airport, rolling suitcases, quiet conversations, the hum of coffee machines, had been replaced by tense whispers and the occasional click of a phone camera. Through it all, Dr. Thompson stood perfectly still, her medical bag clutched in one hand, her other hand resting calmly at her side. Her expression remained professional, but those close enough could see the slight tightening around her eyes, the only visible sign of her growing concern about her patient in Atlanta. The terminal's clock showed 7:40 a.m., 5 minutes past when they should have been boarding. Every tick of the second hand seemed to echo in the tense atmosphere. The crowd continued to grow, with new arrivals quickly being filled in on what was happening through hurried whispers and pointed fingers. As the situation escalated, it became clear that this was no longer just about one security guard and one passenger. It had become something larger, a moment that would force everyone present to confront their own beliefs about prejudice, power, and privilege. And in the next few minutes, Dr. Thompson would deliver words that would not only silence Officer Whitaker, but would resonate with everyone watching, changing perspectives and challenging assumptions in ways none of them expected. At precisely 7:42 a.m., Dr. Thompson opened her phone's photo gallery with steady hands. The terminal had grown so quiet that the soft click of her phone case seemed unusually loud. She turned the screen toward Officer Whitaker, showing him a picture that made his face drain of color. "Do you recognize this patient, Officer Whitaker?" she asked quietly. The photo showed a smiling teenage girl with long brown hair, sitting in a hospital bed. "This is Emma Whitaker. She's 16 years old, and she's Captain James Roberts' daughter. I believe you worked under him for 12 years at the downtown precinct." Officer Whitaker's hands, which had been firmly crossed across his chest, slowly dropped to his sides. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The gathered crowd leaned forward, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "Emma was diagnosed with a rare brain tumor 3 weeks ago," Dr. Thompson continued, her voice calm but clear enough for everyone to hear. Her father, your former captain, specifically requested me for this surgery after consulting with specialists across the country. I'm sure you remember Captain Roberts. He retired last year after 30 years on the force. The security guard's face had turned from pale to ashen. His colleague Bill quietly whispered, "Jim, that's why the name Roberts sounded familiar on today's flight manifest. It's the captain's kid." Dr. Thompson pulled up another photo, this one showing Emma's brain scan. This tumor is located in an extremely delicate area. The surgery needs to happen within the next 4 hours to prevent permanent damage. That's why Captain Roberts arranged this private flight. Every minute counts. The crowd watched as Officer Whittaker stumbled backward slightly, reaching for the desk to steady himself. The pilot, Captain Miller, stepped forward again, his face showing both concern and urgency. "Officer, we really need to get Dr. Thompson on board now. The weather window in Atlanta is critical for landing." A woman in the crowd gasped as she made the connection. "Oh my God, Jim," she said loudly. "Emma's your goddaughter, isn't she? I remember her at the precinct picnics when she was little." Officer Whittaker's hand trembled as he reached for Dr. Thompson's credentials that he had so dismissively tossed aside earlier. He looked at them again, this time seeing what he should have seen from the beginning: the impeccable qualifications, the hospital privileges, the emergency authorization. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize." Dr. Thompson's expression remained professional, but her eyes held a mixture of compassion and urgency. "Officer Whittaker, I understand this is a shock, but right now, Emma needs us both to do our jobs. She's scared, and her parents are counting on me to help their daughter." The businessman who had recognized Dr. Thompson earlier stepped forward. "Jim, my wife Alice was Dr. Thompson's patient last year. Remember Alice from the benefit dinner at the precinct? Dr. Thompson is the reason our kids still have their mother." The terminal had grown completely silent. Even the usual airport announcements seemed to have paused, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Through the windows, the morning sun illuminated the waiting private jet, its stairway already deployed, ready for its critical mission. Officer Whittaker looked down at his hands, then at his badge, and finally at Dr. Thompson. The transformation in his demeanor was striking, from aggressive authority to a man suddenly confronting the real-world consequences of his prejudices. "My God," he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Emma, she's like a daughter to me. I was there the day she was born." His voice cracked slightly. "And I could have." Dr. Thompson checked her watch, 7:47 a.m. She didn't need to speak the urgency aloud. Everyone in the terminal could feel the weight of each passing minute. The young girl's life hanging in the balance made the previous confrontation seem both petty and profound. The crowd watched as Officer Whittaker's face showed the internal struggle of a man whose world had just shifted on its axis. His prejudices had nearly prevented the one person capable of saving his goddaughter from reaching her. The realization seemed to physically age him, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what could have been a tragic mistake. But Dr. Thompson wasn't finished. She had one more thing to say. Words that would not only address the immediate situation, but would leave an indelible mark on everyone present, transforming a moment of prejudice into a powerful lesson about humanity, judgment, and the unseen connections that bind us all together. Officer Whittaker's hands shook as he tried to fill out the security clearance form for Dr. Thompson. The pen slipped twice from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the desk. The crowd watched as this once intimidating man struggled to perform even this simple task, his entire demeanor transformed by the weight of his realization. "Here, let me help you with that," Bill said quietly, taking over the paperwork. The younger security officer efficiently processed Dr. Thompson's credentials, his movements quick and professional, everything that should have happened 15 minutes ago. Whittaker stepped back, his security uniform suddenly seeming too large for his frame. His eyes remained fixed on the photo of Emma still visible on Dr. Thompson's phone screen. The happy, smiling teenager in the image was a stark contrast to the serious medical scans beside it. "I remember her 6th birthday," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I dressed up as a clown, made balloon animals all afternoon. Failed miserably at most of them, but she laughed anyway." He paused, swallowing hard. "She called me Uncle Jim." The morning sun through the terminal windows cast long shadows across the floor, and someone in the crowd quietly sniffled. The young woman who had been recording everything slowly lowered her phone, seeming to realize that this moment was too personal for social media. Dr. Thompson checked her watch again, 7:50 a.m. The pilot caught her eye and nodded, silently confirming that they could still make it if they left immediately. The ground crew outside had already started the final preparations, their movements urgent and purposeful. Whittaker suddenly seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. His face crumpled as the full impact of his actions hit him. If anything had happened to Emma because he couldn't finish the sentence. His legs wobbled, and he grabbed the edge of the security desk for support. Marcus Reynolds, the businessman whose wife Dr. Thompson had saved, stepped forward. "Jim, let me get you some water." He hurried to the cafe, where Sarah already had a cup ready, her own hands trembling slightly as she filled it. The terminal remained unusually quiet. The normal bustle of a private aviation facility had given way to a collective holding of breath. Even the usual announcements seemed muted, as if the building itself understood the gravity of what was unfolding. "I've known Captain Roberts for 20 years, Whittaker continued, his voice breaking. "He trusted me with his daughter's life so many times, birthdays, swimming lessons, school pickups. And today," he looked at Dr. Thompson, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "Today, I almost failed that trust in the worst possible way." Bill finished processing the clearance and handed Dr. Thompson her documents with a respectful nod. "You're all set, Doctor. Captain Miller can escort you to the aircraft now." But before Dr. Thompson could move, Officer Whittaker straightened up. With visible effort, he squared his shoulders and faced her directly. The security guard's face showed the internal struggle of a man whose worldview had just been shattered. "Dr. Thompson," he began, his voice steadier now but heavy with emotion. I don't know how to." He stopped, took a deep breath, and tried again. "What I did was—" Dr. Thompson raised her hand gently, stopping his stumbling apology. The next words she would speak would not only address Whittaker's actions but would resonate with everyone present, transforming this painful moment into something more meaningful. The crowd watched as Officer Whittaker's face registered each emotion: shame, regret, fear, and finally, a dawning understanding. His hands, which had so confidently dismissed Dr. Thompson's credentials earlier, now hung limply at his sides. Through the terminal windows, the jet's engines had started their warm-up sequence. The low hum provided a backdrop to this profound moment of human realization. The morning sun had risen higher, its rays now directly illuminating the scene, as if nature itself was ensuring everyone could clearly see what was unfolding. Maria, the cleaning staff member who had watched everything, quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Sarah from the cafe had abandoned all pretense of work and stood openly watching, her hand pressed against her heart. The young couple with their toddler held each other closer, the child unusually quiet, as if sensing the importance of the moment. What happened next would transform this personal revelation into a powerful lesson about prejudice, consequences, and the unexpected ways our actions can impact those closest to us. Dr. Thompson's response would not only address the immediate situation, but would leave an indelible mark on everyone present, especially Officer Whittaker, whose life would never be quite the same after this morning. Dr. Thompson adjusted her medical bag on her shoulder and looked directly at Officer Whittaker. Her voice, when she spoke, carried neither anger nor accusation, but rather a gentle strength that commanded attention from everyone in the terminal. "Officer Whittaker," she began, her tone measured and clear, "what happened here today is larger than just you and me. It's about Emma, yes, but it's also about every Emma out there whose life might depend on someone being given a fair chance to help them." The security guard's shoulders slumped further, but Dr. Thompson continued, her words filling the hushed terminal. "You see, prejudice isn't just about the immediate hurt it causes. It's like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples spread far beyond the initial point of impact." Sarah, the cafe barista, had stopped trying to pretend she was working. She stood with a coffee pot frozen in midair, tears streaming down her face. Several passengers had pulled out their phones again, but this time they were recording not to document injustice, but to preserve wisdom. "When you stopped me today," Dr. Thompson continued, "you didn't just question my credentials. You nearly prevented a surgeon from reaching her patient. You almost kept a father from getting help for his daughter. You nearly blocked a goddaughter from receiving care from the one person her family trusted most to help her." Officer Whittaker's face showed the pain of each word hitting home. His colleague Bill had stopped his paperwork, pen suspended above the forms, listening intently. "But here's what I want you to understand." Dr. Thompson's voice softened slightly. "This moment doesn't have to define you. It can transform you. Every time we confront our prejudices, we have a choice. We can defend them, or we can learn from them." The morning sun streaming through the windows seemed to intensify, casting a warm glow around Dr. Thompson as she spoke. A flight attendant in the crowd whispered, "I need to write this down." "Today, you learned that prejudice doesn't just hurt strangers, it can harm those closest to us. The same barriers we create to keep others out might end up blocking blessings from reaching our own loved ones." Maria, the cleaning lady, nodded vigorously, wiping her eyes with her uniform sleeve. The businessman, Marcus Reynolds, had taken out his phone and was typing frantically, capturing every word. "I'm going to go now, Officer Whittaker, because Emma needs me," Dr. Thompson said, her tone gentle but firm. "But before I do, I want you to know something. When I operate on her today, I won't be thinking about this morning. I'll be thinking about giving that bright young girl her best chance at a full life." The pilot, Captain Miller, stepped forward, signaling the urgency of their departure, but he too was captivated by Dr. Thompson's words. "And when she wakes up," Dr. Thompson continued, "when she smiles at her parents and maybe even asks for her Uncle Jim to visit, I hope you'll remember this moment. Not with shame, but with understanding, because that's how change happens, not through humiliation, but through realization." Officer Whittaker's eyes filled with tears. His hand reached out, not to block her path this time, but in a gesture of profound regret and gratitude. "The surgery I'm about to perform," Dr. Thompson said, glancing at her watch, "requires incredible precision. One wrong assumption, one hasty judgment, and everything could go wrong. That's true in medicine, Officer Whittaker, and it's true in life." The terminal remained silent except for a few muffled sniffs from the crowd. Even the usual airport announcements seemed to have paused, as if giving space for this moment to unfold. "So I'm not going to tell you that you're a bad person," she concluded, picking up her credentials from the desk. "I'm going to tell you that you're a person who has the power to do better, and I suspect that after today you will." With those words, Dr. Thompson turned toward the exit, her heels clicking on the polished floor. The crowd parted silently, creating a path for her. Captain Miller hurried ahead to open the door, checking his watch and signaling to the ground crew. Behind her, Officer Whittaker stood motionless, transformed by words that had managed to do what no amount of anger or accusation could have accomplished. They had reached his heart through the very love he held for his goddaughter. And in that moment, everyone present knew they had witnessed something rare and precious, the exact instant when understanding dawned and change began. As Dr. Thompson walked toward the exit, the airport's managing director, Robert Chen, burst through the doors. His face was flushed from running, his normally perfect tie slightly askew. He had received multiple calls and messages about the incident, including one from a board member who had witnessed everything. "Dr. Thompson, please accept our deepest apologies," Chen called out, slightly out of breath. He shot a stern look at Officer Whittaker, who seemed to shrink even further into himself. "This is completely unacceptable. Officer Whittaker, your services are no longer required here. Please surrender your badge and—" "Wait." Dr. Thompson's voice cut through the tension like a surgeon's precise incision. She turned back, her hand still on the exit door. "Mr. Chen, if I may have a moment." The crowd, which had started to murmur at the director's arrival, fell silent again. Officer Whittaker stood frozen, his hand halfway to his security badge. "Firing Officer Whittaker won't solve the deeper problem," Dr. Thompson said, her voice carrying across the terminal. "What this airport needs isn't one less prejudice guard. It needs comprehensive changes to prevent this from happening to anyone else." Chen's eyebrows rose in surprise. He had clearly expected demands for immediate dismissal, not a lesson in institutional reform. The businessman who had defended Dr. Thompson earlier nodded in approval, pulling out his phone to take notes. Instead of termination, Dr. Thompson continued, checking her watch quickly, "I suggest mandatory bias training for all security personnel. Not just one session, but ongoing education. Create protocols that require multiple officers to verify any denial of access. Establish a diverse advisory board to review security practices. Maria, the cleaning lady, had stopped pretending to work and was openly watching now, a smile spreading across her face as she listened to Dr. Thompson's suggestions. And Mr. Chen, Dr. Thompson added, I'd be happy to have my hospital's diversity team consult with your staff, after Emma's surgery, of course. She glanced meaningfully at her watch again. The managing director looked thoughtful, then nodded slowly. Yes, of course. Officer Whitaker will be suspended pending completion of comprehensive training and will implement your suggestions immediately. Officer Whitaker, who had been staring at the floor, looked up in disbelief. His eyes met Dr. Thompson's, filled with a mixture of shame and gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Thompson, he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do better. I promise. The pilot, Captain Miller, stepped forward urgently. Dr. Thompson, we really must go now. Our takeoff window. One more thing, Dr. Thompson said, turning to address the whole terminal. Everyone here today witnessed something uncomfortable, but instead of just recording it on your phones, use this as a moment for self-reflection. Ask yourselves, what prejudices do I carry? How might they affect others? Sarah, the cafe barista, quickly wiped tears from her eyes and straightened her apron. I'll start a discussion group with the other staff, she announced suddenly. We can meet weekly to talk about these issues. The managing director nodded approvingly. The airport will support that initiative, Sarah. In fact, we'll make it part of our regular staff development program. Through the windows, the morning sun had fully risen, bathing the terminal in warm light. The private jet's engines hummed with increasing urgency, and Captain Miller was now practically bouncing with anxiety about their departure time. Dr. Thompson, Bill, the other security officer, called out as she finally turned to leave. Will you let us know? About Emma, I mean. She paused at the door and smiled gently. I'll make sure Captain Roberts keeps everyone updated. Then, looking one last time at Officer Whitaker, she added, sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead to our most important growth, if we let them. As Dr. Thompson finally walked toward the waiting aircraft, the terminal erupted in spontaneous applause. The sound followed her out onto the tarmac, where ground crew members, having heard pieces of what happened, stood at respectful attention as she passed. The managing director watched her go, then turned to his staff. All right, everyone. We have work to do. Sarah, get your discussion group organized. Bill, start drafting those new security protocols. And someone get me the contact information for Memorial Hospital's diversity team. Inside the terminal, Officer Whitaker remained standing at his post, changed forever by the last 30 minutes. As he watched the private jet prepare for takeoff, he pulled out his phone and looked at his favorite photo, one of him and Emma at her last birthday party. He silently made a promise, not just to do better, but to be better. The morning's events had transformed a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for real change, proving that sometimes the most powerful resolutions come not from punishment, but from understanding and a commitment to growth. 1 month after the incident at the private terminal, the waiting room at Memorial Hospital buzzed with activity. Emma Roberts sat in a comfortable chair, her long brown hair now growing back nicely after the successful surgery. She was surrounded by a unique group of visitors: Officer James Whitaker, Airport Managing Director Robert Chen, and several staff members from the private terminal. And then, Emma said, laughing as she told the story, Uncle Jim actually tried to juggle the balloon animals at my 6th birthday party. It was a complete disaster. She reached over and squeezed Officer Whitaker's hand affectionately, unaware of how her innocent touch made his eyes water slightly. Whitaker looked different now. The rigid posture and stern expression were gone, replaced by a more thoughtful demeanor. He wore a new pin on his uniform that read, Diversity Ambassador, a role he had volunteered for after completing his extensive training program. Sarah, the cafe barista who had witnessed everything that morning, set down a tray of coffee cups she had brought from the airport terminal. Your story went viral, you know, she told Emma. Well, not just your story, Dr. Thompson's response to everything. It's being used in training programs across the country. The video of that morning had indeed spread far beyond the private terminal. Major news networks had picked up the story, not focusing on the confrontation, but on Dr. Thompson's remarkable response and the positive changes it sparked. The weekly discussion groups at the airport are packed now, Bill, the other security officer, added. We even have staff from other airports flying in to learn about our new protocols. He smiled proudly. Last week, we prevented 3 similar incidents before they could happen. Director Chen nodded, adjusting his perfectly straight tie. Our bias training program has become a model for other facilities. Dr. Thompson's hospital team has been invaluable in helping us develop it. He paused, looking at Emma. And it all started because of you, young lady. Emma's father, Captain Roberts, entered the waiting room carrying several papers. Latest scan results, he announced proudly. Complete success. Dr. Thompson says Emma can return to school next week. The atmosphere in the room brightened even more. Maria, the cleaning lady from the terminal who had become a regular visitor, wiped happy tears from her eyes. She had recently been promoted to supervisor after suggesting several improvements to make the airport more welcoming to diverse passengers. You know what's amazing? Emma said, looking around the room. If Uncle Jim hadn't made that mistake that morning, none of us would be here together like this. Sometimes good things come from bad moments, right? Officer Whitaker swallowed hard. Emma still didn't know the full story of that morning. Her parents had decided to protect her from that knowledge. But her innocent wisdom struck deep into his heart. The door opened, and Dr. Thompson entered, her white coat as crisp as ever. The room fell silent with respect. She smiled warmly at the gathering, particularly at the sight of Officer Whitaker sitting next to Emma. Well, this is quite a reunion, she said, her eyes twinkling. Emma, your latest results are excellent, and Officer Whitaker, I heard about your presentation at the National Airport Security Conference last week. Impressive work. Whitaker blushed slightly. His speech about transforming security protocols to eliminate bias had received a standing ovation. He was now considered a leading voice in reforming airport security culture. The ripples keep spreading, Sarah commented, remembering Dr. Thompson's words from that morning. Last week, 3 other airports adopted our training program, and Emma's story is being taught in medical schools now about the importance of confronting bias in healthcare access. Dr. Thompson sat down next to Emma, picking up her tablet to show her the latest brain scans. The teenager listened intently as the doctor explained everything in simple terms, her face showing no sign of the critical condition she had faced just a month ago. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital grounds. Somewhere in the distance, a private jet could be heard taking off, perhaps carrying another doctor on another life-saving mission. You know what I learned? Emma said suddenly, looking around at all the faces she had come to know during her recovery. Sometimes the best medicine isn't just what fixes our bodies. Sometimes it's what helps us fix our hearts. The room fell quiet, everyone struck by the profound truth in the teenager's words. Dr. Thompson smiled, knowing that while she had saved Emma's life in the operating room, the events of that morning had sparked healing of a different kind. The kind that transforms not just one person, but an entire community. The story of the racist guard and the black doctor had become something more, a testament to the power of wisdom over anger, of education over punishment, and of how one moment of confronted prejudice could ripple outward to change countless lives for the better.